Get out of my seat!" The voice was sharp, laced with venom, and loud enough for half the cabin to hear. A white woman, designer handbag shoved beside her, glared at the young black man standing in the aisle. Her chin tilted upward, her lips curled into a sneer, and her tone wasn't just dismissive, it was dripping with hostility. The man froze for half a second, boarding pass in hand, his eyes flicking from the seat number to the woman who sat there as if she owned the entire plane. He steadied his voice, calm but firm. "Ma'am," he said, holding up the slip of paper between his fingers, "this is seat 3A, and that's mine." She let out a sharp laugh. Cruel, mocking. "Oh, please," she snapped. "Do you even know what first class costs? You must be confused. Maybe coach is back that way." She jabbed a manicured finger toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. The air inside the cabin thickened. Heads turned. Some passengers raised their brows in disbelief, while others sank into their seats, desperate to avoid being pulled into the confrontation. The silence carried weight, judgment, curiosity, and an unspoken tension. The man's jaw clenched. Every instinct in him screamed to fire back, but he took a slow breath. His calmness wasn't weakness. It was control. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice low but cutting. Her smile twisted into a snarl. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she hissed. "You people are always trying to push boundaries, always pretending you belong where you don't. Not today." Gasps scattered through the cabin like sparks. A businessman in the row ahead shifted uncomfortably. A mother hushed her child, pulling him closer. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. They all watched, as though waiting to see just how ugly this would get. The man leaned in slightly, his presence towering even without a raise. Said voice. "With all due respect," he said, each word deliberate, "you don't get to decide where I belong." Her face flushed red. She slammed her hand against the armrest, eyes blazing. "I paid for this seat, and you're not taking it. You can wave that little ticket around all you want, but I'm not moving." The man extended his boarding pass toward the flight attendant who had just hurried over, her smile brittle, her voice shaking. "Is there a problem here?" The woman didn't let her finish. "Yes, there's a problem. This man thinks this is his seat. Ridiculous. Just ridiculous. Why don't you escort him back to where he belongs?" Her words were sharp, designed to humiliate, spat out with the confidence of someone who thought she'd already won. The attendant's eyes flicked down to the pass, then back up to the man. Her brow furrowed. She glanced at the seat number etched in the headrest. A strange pause stretched in the air. The woman smirked, folding her arms triumphantly. Around them, whispers began to rise. "What's going on?" "He's right, though, isn't he?" Unbelievable. The passengers weren't just watching a disagreement. They were watching a battle, a clash between arrogance and dignity, between entitlement and quiet authority. The man didn't flinch. He didn't back down. His gaze was steady, his presence unshakable. And though the woman thought she had the upper hand, she had no idea what storm she had just unleashed. Because this was no ordinary passenger, and this was no ordinary seat. What came next would silence every voice in the cabin. The attendant's pause had stretched too long, the silence heavy with judgment. That's when the young man finally spoke again. Voice calm, deliberate, steady. "Ma'am," he said, turning toward the woman with quiet authority, "this seat belongs to me. I have the boarding pass to prove it." His tone was polite, but the air was steel beneath it. He wasn't begging. He wasn't pleading. He was simply stating a fact. But the woman only laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the air like broken glass. She tilted her head back and smirked, making sure the entire cabin saw her performance. "Oh, I see what this is," she sneered. "You must think you're clever. Flash a ticket, make a scene and hope no one notices you don't belong here. Do you know how much this seat costs? Do you have any idea?" Her words carried an unmistakable edge, the kind of tone sharpened by privilege and fueled by arrogance. And though she never said it outright, everyone in that cabin understood what she meant. Whispers began to ripple across the rows. A man in a business suit muttered under his breath. A young woman by the aisle pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll but really recording. It was no longer just a disagreement about a chair. It was a public trial, one man against perception itself. The young man's jaw tightened. He met her smug stare without flinching. "Yes," he said simply. "I know exactly how much this seat costs." For a fleeting second, the smile slipped from her face, but she quickly snapped it back into place, doubling down with a huff. "Well, if you knew, you'd understand this isn't the kind of place where people like you sit. So why don't you save yourself the embarrassment and head to the back where you belong?" Gasps echoed again. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unwilling to confront the ugliness unraveling before them. Others leaned in, compelled by the raw tension they couldn't turn from. The attendant glanced nervously between the two, but the man lifted a hand slightly, stopping her from speaking. His eyes never left the woman. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know what I can afford. And yet, you've already decided who I am." That line lingered, hovering like smoke above the rows of leather seats. Even those who had stayed silent felt the weight of it. But the woman scoffed again, refusing to yield. "Please, I can tell. I've flown first class more times than I can count, and I've never seen someone like you up here. Don't try to fool me." Her smugness landed like a slap. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a dagger of prejudice, sharpened by assumption. The young man didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't flinch. He simply stood his ground, his quiet dignity a mirror that only made her ugliness more visible. Around them, the cabin was no longer neutral. Some passengers began to shift in their seats, aligning themselves with one side or the other. A few stared coldly at the woman, disapproving but silent. Others looked at the man with suspicion, as if his very presence demanded proof. Lines were being drawn in whispers, and the tension grew heavier with every second. And yet, through it all, the man stood calm. Because he knew something the woman didn't. Something none of them knew. And when it was finally revealed, it wouldn't just change the course of this flight. It would leave everyone on board speechless. The cabin had become a stage, and every eye was fixed on the standoff in row 3. The air buzzed with an uneasy energy, like a storm about to break. The woman sat rigid in her stolen seat, arms crossed, her expression dripping with defiance. The young man stood tall in the aisle, calm but unyielding, and around them, the passengers were no longer just spectators. They were jurors, each silently deciding where they stood. It started with a voice from behind. "She's right," a man muttered, his tone sharp, almost eager to take sides. "Come on, this is first class. Let's not waste everyone's time." His words carried the weight of assumption, quickly joining the woman's side. Another voice, softer, cut in from across the aisle. "But he has the ticket. Doesn't that mean it's his?" A middle-aged woman clutched her purse nervously, glancing between the two like she was afraid of saying too much. The whispers spread like fire. Some passengers nodded at the seated woman, silently validating her entitlement. Others looked away, refusing to be part of it. But a few, very few, kept their gaze on the man, and there was respect in their eyes. The flight attendant cleared her throat, her professional smile trembling. "Please, everyone," she said gently. "Let's keep calm. We'll resolve this." But even her voice wavered, as though she too felt the weight of the prejudice suffocating the cabin. The woman seized the moment, leaning forward. "Exactly. Resolve it," she barked. "Escort him back where he belongs so we can take off already." Her words slammed into the silence like a hammer. The businessman in the back nodded approvingly, muttering, "Finally, someone said it." But then another voice rose, firmer, sharper. "No," said a young passenger near the window, his tone steady. "I saw his ticket. It said 3A. That's this seat. She's the one who doesn't belong here." The ripple shifted. For the first time, the woman's smug confidence cracked. She whipped her head toward the young passenger, eyes blazing. "Excuse me. Do you know who I am?" "No," the young man in the window seat replied calmly. "And it doesn't matter. A seat number is a seat number." Gasps broke out, some passengers covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disapproval. The tension thickened, pulling the entire cabin into its grip. Through it all, the man at the center of the storm remained silent, his composure a striking contrast to the chaos swirling around him. He didn't need to raise his voice. The strength of his presence spoke louder than words. The flight attendant glanced at him, then at the woman, her cheeks paling. She held the boarding pass in her trembling hand. Everyone waited for her verdict. But she hesitated. The whispers swelled into a murmur. Two camps had formed, those who sided with the woman, blinded by her arrogance, and those who sided with the man, drawn to the quiet, dignity in his stance. It was no longer just about a seat. It was about pride, prejudice, and perception. The woman leaned back in the chair, gripping the armrests as though anchoring herself to power. "See," she said triumphantly, "even the crew can't do anything. That tells you everything you need to know." But it didn't. Not yet. Because the silence that followed wasn't weakness. It was a pause before the storm. And what would happen next would tilt the balance forever. The cabin had grown so quiet you could almost hear the hum of the engines beneath the floor. Every passenger leaned forward, eyes locked on the single piece of paper trembling in the flight attendant's hand. The young man didn't flinch. He extended his boarding pass again, this time gently placing it in the attendant's palm. His movements were calm, deliberate, like a man with nothing to prove, only the truth to show. The woman, however, leaned back with a smirk stretching wide across her face. She whispered just loud enough for those around her to hear. "Watch this. He's about to be marched back to coach where he belongs." A few passengers chuckled nervously at her arrogance. Others frowned, their eyes narrowing with disapproval. And still, the cabin waited. The attendant scanned the ticket carefully. Her eyes darted to the seat number engraved on the leather headrest. 3A. Her brows pulled tight. A bead of sweat formed on her temple. She looked at the woman, then at the man. The silence thickened, pressing down on everyone's chest. "Well?" the woman demanded, tapping her manicured nails against the armrest. "Tell him he's mistaken. Tell him to move along." But the attendant didn't answer right away. She swallowed hard, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The boarding pass in her hand was no longer just a slip of paper. It was a verdict, one that could no longer be delayed. Around them, the whispers began to rise again. "Whose seat is it?" someone asked. "Why is she taking so long?" another murmured. The air buzzed with restless anticipation, like a jury waiting for the judge to speak. The man stood silent, steady, his gaze fixed on the attendant. He didn't need to defend himself with words. His composure alone unsettled the woman, whose smug expression now twitched at the edges. Finally, the attendant exhaled. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Seat 3A belongs to him." Gasps erupted through the cabin. The smirk melted from the woman's face, replaced by a flush of red that crept up her neck. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked uncertain, cornered by truth she could no longer twist. The man didn't gloat. He didn't smirk back. He simply held her gaze, calm as ever, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. The passengers stirred, their restlessness shifting into murmurs. Some nodded in satisfaction, pleased the truth had been revealed. Others looked embarrassed for ever doubting him. And yet, beneath it all, there was still a sense that the story wasn't over. Because it wasn't. The woman's pride wouldn't let her surrender easily. And the man still had more to reveal, something that would turn this small clash into something unforgettable. For now, though, the cabin sat in uneasy balance, perched on the edge of a greater truth. And what came next would shatter the last illusion of control she thought she had. The verdict had been spoken. Seat 3A was his. The cabin knew it, the attendant knew it, and now even the woman who sat there in defiance knew it. But instead of exploding in triumph, instead of rubbing the truth in her face, the young man did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a smug smile, not a smile of arrogance, but a soft, measured smile, the kind that disarmed rather than provoked. "Thank you," he said quietly to the attendant, his voice calm, steady, almost gentle. Then he turned to the woman. "I'd like to sit down now. Will you let me take my place?" The words were so simple, so polite, that for a moment the entire cabin froze. He wasn't demanding, he wasn't threatening. He was offering her one final chance to step down with grace. And that, more than any raised voice, unsettled her. The woman's smirk faltered. Her fingers clutched the armrests as if they were lifelines. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sharpness had dulled. You don't understand," she stammered. "I've flown this airline for years. I always sit here. People like me sit here." The man's eyes softened, but his tone carried weight. "And people like me?" he asked gently. The question hung in the air like a mirror, forcing her to look at her own reflection. A few passengers shifted in their seats, the unease now directed at her rather than him. Whispers that once supported her arrogance now leaned toward admiration for his restraint. The businessman who had earlier sided with her cleared his throat uncomfortably and looked away. The young woman with the phone lowered it, her expression changing from curiosity to quiet respect. The atmosphere was shifting. The man hadn't raised his voice, but his presence was growing larger, commanding the space without force. He placed a hand on the back of the seat, speaking once more. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here because this is where I belong, and nothing you say will change that." His words rolled through the cabin, calm but undeniable. They weren't just for her. They were for everyone watching, every silent juror who had been weighing his worth. The woman swallowed hard. Her confidence wavered, her certainty crumbling under the weight of his composure. She had expected anger, she had expected outrage, but she hadn't expected grace. And grace, in this moment, was more powerful than fury. The flight attendant shifted closer, sensing the tide turning. "Ma'am," she said softly, almost pleading now, "it would be best if you let him take his seat." The woman's lips trembled, her eyes darting around the cabin, but all she saw were stares, some sharp with judgment, others softened with disappointment. No one was on her side anymore. The man, however, never moved his gaze. He remained patient, his hand steady on the seat. His silence told her that time was running out. She exhaled shakily, realizing she was cornered, not by force, but by the undeniable truth and dignity of the man standing before her. And as her pride faltered, the rest of the cabin leaned in, knowing something even bigger was about to unfold, because the story wasn't over. The politeness was only the beginning. The revelation was still to come. The tension inside the cabin had reached its breaking point. The woman still sat stubbornly in the seat, her pride clinging to the last threads of defiance. The passengers held their breath, waiting for the man to snap, to finally lash out. But he didn't. Instead, he took one slow step closer. His calm presence seemed to press against the woman harder than any raised voice ever could. He looked down at her, his tone low but steady, carrying weight that made the hairs on the back of every neck stand up. "I've asked politely," he said. "I've shown my ticket. The truth has been made clear. But since that isn't enough for you..." He paused. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate, pulling every ear toward his next words. Then, with a single breath, he delivered the line that would shatter the room. "Perhaps I should tell you the real reason why this seat will always belong to me." The woman scoffed, though her smirk twitched with unease. "Oh? And what reason is that?" The man's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Because," he said, his voice firm, resonant, echoing through the stunned cabin, "I own this airline." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Gasps erupted like a wave crashing against the cabin walls. A businessman's jaw dropped. A mother clutched her child closer, whispering in disbelief. The young woman with the phone nearly fumbled it, her eyes wide as saucers. And the woman in seat 3A froze. Her face drained of color. The smugness that had once clung to her expression evaporated in an instant. She stared at him, mouth open but soundless, like her very voice had been stolen away. The flight attendant, eyes wide, straightened immediately. She bowed her head slightly, her posture shifting from nervous to respectful. She already knew who he was. She had just been too afraid to say it aloud. And now the truth was out. Whispers rose into a chorus. Did he just say, "He owns the airline"? No way. The man didn't gloat. He didn't grin or revel in the shock he'd unleashed. He simply let the truth hang in the air, unshakable, undeniable. His silence was louder than their gasps. The woman shook her head, stammering, desperate to cling to her pride. You're lying. You can't possibly." But her words lacked power. Her arrogance had crumbled, and the cabin knew it. The man finally leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear, but loud enough for the nearest passengers to catch. "Next time," he said, "before you judge someone's worth, make sure you know who you're speaking to." Her lips trembled. For once, she had no comeback. The attendant stepped in firmly, her voice now carrying respect. "Sir, please, allow me to help you with your seat." She motioned gracefully, almost ceremonially, as though she were guiding a king to his throne. The passenger's eyes followed every move as the woman scrambled out of the seat, her body stiff with humiliation. She stumbled into the aisle, her cheeks blazing red. And then, in an almost surreal moment, the man lowered himself into 3A, not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. The cabin was still buzzing, but it wasn't just chatter anymore. It was awe. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't merely a man claiming his rightful seat. It was a lesson, delivered with grace, with patience, and with a single sentence that turned the entire room upside down. The woman stood frozen by the aisle, clutching her handbag, her head bowed not in respect, but in shame. And yet the man never looked at her again. His point had been made. The passengers whispered among themselves, their voices laced with disbelief. Some looked at him with admiration. Others sat quietly, reflecting on the ugly assumptions they had allowed themselves to believe only moments earlier. But one thing was certain. The story of what just happened would not stay in that cabin. It would spread, retold by every witness, carried far beyond this flight. And for the woman who thought she owned the moment, the humiliation was only beginning. Because the flight had just taken off, and so had the real story. The moment hung in the air like thunder after a lightning strike. His words, "I own this airline," still echoed through the cabin, and the woman who had once sat so confidently in his seat was now trembling under the weight of them. Her cheeks flushed crimson, the smirk she once wore replaced with a look of panic. She clutched her handbag like a shield, her eyes darting desperately from passenger to passenger, searching for an ally, but finding none. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice breaking as she tried to gather herself. "You should have said something sooner. How was I supposed to—" But the excuses fell flat. No one nodded in agreement. No one defended her anymore. Every word only made her pettiness more obvious. The businessman who had once sided with her now sat in shame, avoiding her gaze entirely. The young woman with the phone shook her head slowly, recording every second with eyes wide in disbelief. A mother whispered to her child, "Remember this moment. Remember what respect looks like." The woman's arrogance, once so loud and dominant, had collapsed into desperation. She tried again, her voice rising. "I didn't mean it like that. I didn't know who you were." The man in seat 3A finally turned to face her, his expression calm, his eyes steady. "That's exactly the point," he said softly. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." The cabin went silent again, the truth in his words cutting deeper than any insult could. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rage. It was a lesson, and everyone on that flight felt it. The woman's lips trembled, but she had no reply. She sank back into the aisle seat she'd been given, her posture no longer proud, but small, defeated. She pulled her sunglasses down in a feeble attempt to hide, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Her arrogance had been stripped away, her prejudice laid bare for all to see. Meanwhile, whispers of admiration rippled through the rows. "The way he handled that," one passenger murmured. "Unbelievable composure." Another leaned toward his neighbor. "That's what real power looks like." The CEO didn't bask in the praise. He didn't revel in her downfall. He simply adjusted his jacket, leaned back in his rightful seat, and closed his eyes for a moment. The image of dignity itself. The woman sat frozen, every tick of the clock drawing her deeper into the humiliation she had crafted with her own arrogance, and the passengers, one by one, shifted their perspective. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about what happens when prejudice collides with truth. The fall of her arrogance was complete, but the lesson was only beginning. Because soon, he would make sure the entire cabin understood that this was more than a personal victory. It was a moment meant to change the way they all saw the world. The cabin was still buzzing, but it wasn't the same restless tension as Beffy. Now it was quieter, reflective, as though everyone was waiting to hear what the man in seat 3A would say next. He sat upright, hands folded neatly on his lap, his gaze calm yet commanding. A businessman whispered to the woman beside him, "That's leadership right there, pure leadership." The young woman with the phone replayed the moment in her mind, not just as a clip to save, but as a lesson she would never forget. The plane lifted from the ground, rising smoothly into the sky. Still, the incident lingered, hanging in the air heavier than the altitude itself. Every bump, every shift of the aircraft carried with it an echo of what had just happened. Whispers passed between rows like secrets. "I can't believe she said that." "Did you see how calm he stayed?" He owned the airline. Imagine that. Each voice carried awe, each reflection peeling back layers of their own hidden biases. The CEO closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He didn't need their whispers. He didn't need their admiration. His peace came not from proving himself, but from knowing that dignity will always silence arrogance. And yet, around him, passengers couldn't help but reflect. Some thought about times they had been judged unfairly. Others thought about the times they had judged too quickly. Every person carried their own silent reckoning, stirred awake by what they had witnessed at 30,000 feet. The lesson wasn't just his to give, it was theirs to carry forward. The plane pierced through the clouds, sunlight streaming across the windows, casting a glow over the cabin. It felt almost symbolic, as though this flight was leaving behind not just the runway, but a moment of ignorance, carrying instead a new clarity. And though the cabin had settled, every passenger knew the story wasn't finished, because when this plane landed, the world outside would soon hear what had unfolded in seat 3A. But before that moment came, there was one final lesson waiting to be spoken. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons are not taught in classrooms, but in unexpected moments. Moments like this one, high above the clouds. The cabin had grown quiet again, but it was not the same silence of tension. It was the silence of reflection, the kind that settles in when people are forced to confront themselves. Every passenger carried their own thoughts, their own reckoning with what had just unfolded. The woman who once clung to arrogance now sat small in her seat, her pride stripped away. She had spoken with entitlement, judged with prejudice, and assumed she held power. But in the end, her downfall had not come from anger or revenge. It had come from something much stronger: humility. The young black CEO had not raised his voice, had not sought to humiliate her in return. Instead, he had used patience, restraint, and dignity as his armor. In doing so, he revealed the truth, not only about himself, but about the world they all lived in. Arrogance blinds, prejudice corrupts, and entitlement always collapses under the weight of truth. But humility opens eyes. Patience disarms hostility. And true power, real, undeniable power, is found not in shouting someone down, but in rising above them with integrity. The passengers had seen it firsthand. They had witnessed how a single man, calm and unwavering, shifted the atmosphere of an entire cabin. They had felt the sting of the woman's words, and then the grace of his response. And in that contrast, a lesson had been etched deeply into their memory. Respect is not earned by wealth. It is not demanded by arrogance. It is not granted to one group and denied to another. Respect is the foundation of humanity, owed to everyone, no matter who they are or where they sit. The CEO leaned back in his seat, not as a victor basking in glory, but as a man who had proven that dignity is the highest form of strength. He did not need applause, though admiration rippled silently through the rows. His victory was not in owning the airline, it was in showing what it means to own oneself. The woman's reluctant apology still echoed faintly in the minds of those around her. It wasn't much, but perhaps it was a beginning. Perhaps, when she stepped off that plane, she would carry more than shame. Perhaps she would carry the seed of change. And perhaps the others would too. Because this story wasn't just about one man, or one woman, or one flight. It was about all of us. About the assumptions we make, the judgments we cast, and the choice we face every day, to tear others down, or to treat them with the respect we all deserve. At 30,000 feet, a lesson had been taught, but its message belonged on the ground, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in neighborhoods, and in homes. The woman had lost her seat. But in truth, it was more than a seat she lost. She lost the illusion that arrogance could shield her from truth. And the man? He gained nothing new that day. He already had his seat, his title, his power. What he gave instead was a reminder that the greatest strength a person can show is not dominance, but dignity. And that is the story that followed every passenger as the plane soared above the clouds. A story not just about an airline, but about humanity itself.